You're listening to Stealing from Wizards, Volume 3, Kidnapping, by R.A. Consul. Chapter 29, Ascension. Traveling to Avalon Island for the graduation ceremony was a strange experience. Kuro had only ever been on the Princess when it was populated with students. On this trip, it was full of the adults who were typically abandoned in the parking lot when the ferry set off. They were the families of the graduates, of the students who would be flying up to the high school for the very first time, and of the senior high schoolers who would be doing it for the very last. The typical noise and excitement were replaced by people congratulating each other on the accomplishments of their children, and insufferable small talk. The only other children on the boat were a smattering of siblings still too young to attend Avalon. They were constantly lied to, being told that running, shouting, and playing were not allowed on the ferry. Kuro was protected from anything more than curious glances by the company he kept. He boarded with the parents of his friends, Charlie's father Jack, Marie's mother in her old disguise as the Queen's handmaiden Nancy, and Arthur's parents, Dubois and Lady Aine. While many of the other passengers considered themselves important enough to demand almost anything from anyone, that pedigree carried with it a sensible and refined form of cowardice. Even if they might have considered bothering Kuro, his company generated a powerful aura of civility. While everyone was desperate to get the story of what happened at the Summer Palace straight from the source, no one braved a single question and instead engaged in hushed gossip. Avalon welcomed him home with all the scents and sounds of the perpetual spring. The wind showered him with leaves and petals and urged him to run with her across the seasons. "Go get your uniform on and find your friends," said Dubois. "We'll see you up there." The collection of parents unrolled their carpets and mounted their brooms so they could fly up to where the graduation ceremony would be. They soared up to the top of the butte on which the high school sat, which left Kuro alone and fully free on Avalon for the first time since he had been given the anchor. With the west wind at his back, he ran. Through spring, summer, and fall, as fast as his feet could keep up, he ran. By the time he reached Autumn Lodge, half of the leaf litter between there and the docks was following in his wake. He was out the door again as soon as he had enough of his uniform donned not to shock the occupants of the lounge as he passed through. Having missed any instructions or practice others might have received for the ceremony, he could only guess at where to go. He dashed back to Summer, to the glade where Marie had practiced flying, in the vain hope of finding his friends there. He must have misremembered the path, because what he thought should be an opening to the meadow was blocked by a large tree, which, given the shade of the forest and the irresponsible speed at which he was traveling, he didn't notice until it was too late to stop. He tripped, skidded, and slid into the trunk with a clang. That was an odd sound for a tree to make, he thought. It was similarly unusual for the tree to turn around. What he had mistaken for a trunk revealed itself to be the leg of a towering behemoth of a knight. It was at least 10 feet of tarnished bronze, brown and speckled with green rust like an old lichen-covered tree. It even appeared to have a raccoon nesting in it. The armor splintered and revealed its owner. Azalea Lamorak stepped out of the disintegrating suit and stared at Kuro as if looking at a ghost. One of the giant hands lifted the raccoon off its shoulder and handed it down to Azalea before it shattered and retreated into her bronze cuffs. "Kuro?" she asked almost too quietly to hear. She stared at him, wide-eyed, as though he'd returned from the dead. Then, with a speed he didn't imagine the frail girl capable of, she launched herself at him. Her arms encircled him, pinning his down. His first thought was that he was being attacked, but there was no violence in her assault. She held him tightly, attaching herself like an anchor, refusing him the possibility of disappearing again. Her cheek pressed against his ear, making her barely spoken words ring loudly. "You came back." It was all at once an expression of joy and anguish, an expression of relief and an admonishment for having left. Without the bulk of Azalea's armor blocking the view, Kuro could see the full clearing. 3 knights still guarded it. McCool was there in his familiar copper armor, acting as the commander for the others. The second wore Lady Aine's silver armor, but the bearer was smaller and moved with Moira's unearned confidence. Finally, there was another knight Kuro didn't remember seeing. Their armor like polished obsidian with rivers of lava flowing beneath its surface, like the other set of Lamorak armor he'd seen in the vault. He could only assume it was Belladonna. The reason for their presence was the young woman in the middle of the clearing with giant black feathered wings and a tiara. She looked well, outwardly unharmed by the events at the palace, but clearly changed. She stood with the poise of a royal, and while she wore the simple gray blazer and slacks of the school uniform, they'd been expertly tailored and embellished with silver embroidery to mark her as special. Peeking out from her sleeves were the bright gold cuffs containing the royal armor. She radiated royalty, and yet she had not left her upbringing entirely behind. She had kept her chunky Blandlands glasses and returned her hair to the collection of braids she'd started the year with. Next to Marie stood a saddled Henrietta. Atop the majestic winged unicorn was Charlie, though she was hard to recognize beneath the helmet and parachute pack she wore. She was in the process of buckling and strapping herself to the saddle. Her flight over New Camelot had given her enough trust in Henrietta to carry her, but had not quashed her fear of flying. Nearby, Arthur was unrolling an oversized flying carpet, easily big enough for 4. It must have taken every spare minute he had to weave the enchanted paisley pattern. In front of them, Meredith, grinning like a proud parent at her juniors, lectured on what was expected of them during the ceremony. Her explanation was interrupted by a man in copper shouting an accusation. "Why have you retracted your armor while on duty, Squire Lamorak?" The voice was unmistakably that of Sir McCool, although it was the first time Kuro had ever heard him taking something seriously. She released Kuro and pushed him away from her as if he'd suddenly grown thorns. Even so, she refused to let him go completely, as if he would disappear again the moment she released him. Holding him at arm's length, she shouted over her shoulder loudly enough for the whole clearing to hear. "It's Kuro!" It was a good thing that Azalea had a firm grip on him. Otherwise, he would have run. The stampede caused by her announcement threatened to crush him to death. He couldn't tell who or how many of them had tackled him. The little breath he had left after his running was crushed out as arms and wings wrapped around him. He even felt Autolycus's tiny paws around his calf. Without the bracelet keeping her apart from him, the West Wind was no longer jealous of those who could touch him. She swirled around the group, joining the embrace and pressing them closer together. They yelled at him for leaving, demanded he explain himself, and then refused him even the slightest chance to do so as they expressed their joy and relief at his return. "I'm sorry," was all he managed to get out. "Thanks for coming to save me," said Marie after enough collective emotion had poured out to say something intelligible. Her Montreal accent intermingled with the Royal Tirnanog one that had been inflicted on her. "I'm glad I did," he replied. "Are you okay?" "Mostly," she said. "You?" "Mostly," Kuro echoed. "I missed you folks." "We missed you too," said Marie, gifting Kuro a gentle smile that spoke of the months of uncertainty he'd subjected them to by running, and crushed the air from his lungs more effectively than the hugs he'd received. "No, absolutely not. No sad feelings." Charlie interrupted the moment. She snorted back a running nose before continuing to berate her friends. "You made me put on makeup for this thing, and I am not ruining it by crying before we even get there. Besides, we're gonna be late if we sit around saying how much we all love each other." Charlie turned her back to her friends and clambered onto Henrietta to begin the process of strapping herself onto the saddle. "Besides, the sun is starting to go down, and I don't want to be flying in the dark." From the break in the trees above them, they could see the other students taking their first or final journeys up to the high school. "Are you joining us?" asked Marie. "I guess so," Kuro confirmed. "You can ride on my carpet if you need to," said Arthur. "I made it with enough space to carry passengers, just in case you came back and needed help getting up." A lot went unspoken in that invitation. He must have spent countless hours making that carpet vastly larger and stronger than it needed to be. All that time and effort for Kuro's benefit, even though he might have never returned. Kuro wandered over and tried to kick the dirt off his sneakers, not wanting to stain his roommate's work. "Does it count?" he asked. "I thought I had to get up myself." "Ms. McCutcheon said it would be okay," said Arthur. "For tonight anyway. You'll have to find a way up before we start high school in the fall, though. You are coming to high school, right?" "I think so," said Kuro, and startled himself by hoping it was true. He was a little disappointed to ride up on the carpet, though. He had always wanted to climb up to the school ever since his first day on the island. Seeing his friends all prepared to fly on their own, even Charlie, who was fighting back her fear with every ounce of her strength, he wanted to join them. The west wind ran through his hair as if inviting him to join her in the sky. "Actually, I think I can make it up myself," he said. "Oh, are you coming with me?" asked Meredith, knowing he'd long wished to join her. "I wouldn't mind the company. It's my last climb after all, but it's a long way up. I'm not sure I could carry you if you got tired." "Nah, I think I have another way." He pulled his umbrella from his book bag. With the strap wrapped firmly around his wrist and a firm grip on the handle, he popped it open and let the wind fill it. It lifted him skyward, up and above the trees, out into the open air, while his friends scrambled to catch up. Marie was unstable but resolute, beating her massive wings in time with Henrietta's. The wind reached out and offered some aid, helping both climb on a gentle updraft. Arthur made an unhurried ascent, carrying his sister and Azalea up on his rug. The pair had earned an invitation to the proceedings by acting as the Queen's guards. The wind set him down reluctantly on the soft grass of the high school grounds. All around, the other graduates were landing. The graduating junior high students crossed the high school threshold for the first time, while the senior students did so for their last. Where the junior high had felt almost cozy, with wood floors worn down from decades of student shoes marching through its maze of narrow halls, the high school was cavernous. It was all gray slate and white marble. Statues of ancient rulers welcomed them into the grand entry foyer, which was painted in rainbows by the setting sun passing through the stained glass windows. Not yet allowed to explore, they were directed into the auditorium, originally meant to house debates between the nobility of the three kingdoms. It seemed too fancy for the student theater productions and school assemblies it now housed. The ceremony was comfortingly dull. Ms. McCutcheon gave a speech she must have delivered at least a dozen times before about how far her students had come and how she would miss each and every one of them, which made Kuro doubt her sincerity. The high school principal, Mr. Thrimson, followed with a speech intended to welcome the new students and bid farewell to the old, but his deep, droning voice mostly lulled people to sleep. Charlie fidgeted constantly and talked through both, a comforting constant in a ceremony all about change. Arthur found the experience of walking across a stage in front of an audience more harrowing than their imprisonment in Niflheim. Marie, even though she was watched by knights for the entire event, sat with and collected her diploma like any of the other students. Kuro found himself getting choked up more than once for reasons he couldn't explain. When Meredith Thrump walked across the stage, his dam burst and tears flowed. Whether for happiness at her success or sadness at her leaving him behind, he couldn't say. Perhaps he was just moved at how proud she looked at her own accomplishments. His own diploma felt like a forgery. It hadn't yet been earned. He hadn't passed a single class, and it may well be revoked before the end of the summer. Ms. McCutcheon, however, gave him some whispered words as she handed it over, which buoyed his confidence. "Don't hesitate to come visit us sometimes," she said, as if she might never see him again if he didn't. "Danny would miss you." Afterward, while all the new graduates were being congratulated and receiving gifts from their parents, Kuro faded into the background. He was more comfortable out of the light and the noise, and there was nothing in the attendees' pockets he fancied acquiring. He wandered the expertly tended gardens of the high school grounds for a time before finding himself at the edge, overlooking the autumn quarter. It was dark, the leaves of the unending fall dull in the moonlight. Music floated out from the high school, and the wind whirled around him, inviting him to dance. Unfurling his umbrella, he leapt into the night. The west wind caught him and carried him out over the forest. bouncing and spinning like a piece of dandelion fluff. With the umbrella, he could catch her and let her go, to play and twirl together like never before. They waltzed across the sky until his arms turned to jelly from holding the umbrella. Then, at last, she set him down outside his home at Autumn Lodge. After so long away, and such a taxing day, the call of his bed was strong. The others would be celebrating for hours yet. All he could imagine wanting, though, was sleep. He wished good night to the west wind, and to the non-graduates in the lounge as he passed and went to his room. There, he found that someone had sent him a graduation present. A long box wrapped in brown paper sat in the middle of his bed. The Luton Post must have delivered it during the ceremony. He opened it to find nestled inside an elegant sword with a long, narrow blade covered in runes from hilt to tip. On top of Excalibur was a card, written in a precise hand, which read, "In recognition of an expertly played game. Congratulations, my boy. Yours in perpetuity, Claudius Roche." This is the final chapter of Kidnapping. Thank you so much for listening. This is a passion project, and the outpouring of support from our audience has been amazing. This production lives and dies by word of mouth, so we would be incredibly grateful if you could share this with friends and family, talk about it on your social media, rate and review wherever you listen, and generally tell the world that we exist. Book 4 is in the works, but like the previous ones, there will be a substantial gap between books. Stay subscribed, and those chapters will start showing up in your feed someday in the uncertain future. Thank you again for all of your support. Until next time.